Singapore.
I'm Evan. I don't really know what I want to study. I'm from Seattle.
I'm Nick. I'm also a freshman from Canton, Ohio. Right now, I'm in Pratt and following an electrical engineering track, and I'm also a pre-med, kind of filling those requirements hand in hand.
NFL Hall of Fame, right?
Yeah, yes, sir. NFL Football Hall of Fame. I have the flag up in my room.
Yes.
I'm Ethan from Virginia Beach, Virginia, originally from Delaware, and I'm interested in sociology.
Hi, my name is Mark. I'm from New York, and I'm interested in economics.
Okay. Great. So, so we're going to talk. I'm going to tell a story that's a real story, and really this is sort of going to be a dialogue about the use of history in public policy, and I think I hope we're going to talk some about what do we know about the past, why are there things that happen that we don't know about, how can we figure out what our shared history actually is, and how can we sort of learn how to talk about that and decide what it means for us today. So I'm a part of a group that is writing a book, a group of faculty that's writing a book that's talking about how has the South changed and how is it the same. There's a famous book written in the 40s by a guy called V.O. Key, and it's a book about politics in the American South. And so we're saying what's the same, what's different. And so I was, you have faculty together and we're chatting, and I told a story about my granddaddy, who was a tobacco farmer and pig farmer in Greene County, North Carolina, which is about 100 miles east of here. And I told the story about my granddaddy losing a hunting dog near Browntown. And Adrienne Lentz-Smith, who is a history professor of Reconstruction here at Duke, she said, well, Don, Browntown, why do you call it Browntown? And I said, oh, it's Browntown because that's where people of mixed race live. And she said, how do you know that? And I said, what do you mean, how do I know that? Everybody knows that. It's just something that everybody knows. And, as a historian, she said, well, that's not a very good answer from a historical perspective. Why don't you actually investigate that? Because maybe you've made all these assumptions, which was true, about this place, and you just assumed everything about it. Why don't you see what you can find out about it? And so I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe I'll do that. So I went over to UNC, and they've got the Wilson Library. They've got a huge archival collection of stuff on the American South. And in an afternoon, I started digging into trying to figure out how Browntown got its name, to figure out, what was the origin story of Browntown? And I think I have discovered the origin story of Browntown, and it is a rich plantation owner and enslaver named Benjamin Edwards had 2 children with a woman who he owned from the time she was 1 year old, named Eliza. So Benjamin and Eliza Edwards had 2 kids, Edith and William Edwards, in the 1830s and 1840s. And Theophilus Edwards, who's the father of Benjamin, in 1820, he actually deeded some property to his son Benjamin. Included in the property were 12 enslaved people, and Eliza was 1 year old when Benjamin came to own her. And so about 12 years later, Benjamin had a child with Eliza. So I was like, oh my gosh, what a kind of a jarring sort of story. A man owns a child, and then in 12 years has another child with that child. And if you read American history, that's a reasonably common thing to happen. Enslavers and enslaved people often had children together. You can imagine there's all kinds of complicated, power dynamics in that. But in this case, Benjamin bought a 250-acre farm for these two children. And the 250-acre farm is near where what is today called Browntown in Greene County. And it's Browntown is not just a euphemism. It's actually a census place. There's Browntown, Greene County, North Carolina. So Benjamin bought this farm for them, and he died a few years later. And from what I can put together, being the offspring of a rich landowner and an enslaved woman that he owned, being brown or being mixed race or being in Browntown provided protection for them. So in the 1850s, 1860s, up until the Civil War, they had, because of their mixed race nature, probably some relative protection or relative privilege. And this farm was a big, 250-acre farm is a big farm for Eastern North Carolina standards. So anyway, I sort of am tracking this family. At this point, I'm kind of intrigued, like, wow, this is an interesting story. It's kind of cool. I knew it as Browntown, and all of a sudden you're realizing, where that came from. And so I find them, using the census, doing archival research. I can track the children pretty well, but Eliza, the enslaved woman, kind of disappears. I can't find her. And the way the census was done, it wasn't until 1850 that each person was named. So sometimes that happens, and the census can be tricky to use. But in the 1900 census, I find Eliza living with both Edith and William on the Browntown farm, on the farm that Benjamin had bought for his offspring. And so Eliza, is a freed slave who's living with her kids that she had with the man that owned her from the time she was 1 year old. But now she's she's no longer enslaved because the country's abolished slavery. And I was looking at the census, and a name caught my eye in the adjacent entry point. And there was a 2-year-old little girl named Blanche Sugg who lived in the adjacent farm. And Blanche Sugg was my great grandmother. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so all of a sudden I was thinking, so there's an 87-year-old freed slave, living in this place that's very familiar to me, meaning I've drove past Browntown hundreds of times and never really thought much about it. Just never thought much about it, other than that's where people of mixed race live. And then something about, seeing, oh my gosh, my great grandmother lived, adjacent to this farm. It just kind of like really said, man, I got to know more about this story. And so there's a big shift. So if Browntown or being mixed race protected them in 1850, they were a little closer to white than being enslaved. By the 1920s, Browntown made them vulnerable. And so in 1923, a fellow named Jack Hill, whose grandmother was Eliza Edwards, so his grandparents were the enslaver and the enslaved woman. Jack Hill's farming the farm. At that point, this family had lived on that farm for half of the history of the United States. So they'd lived there. I can find evidence they've taken out 3 mortgages, paid them off. And in 1923, Jack goes with his daughter and to get dry goods and to, get them on credit and loan. And a rich, powerful store owner, his last name was Exum. He, according to an eyewitness, told them, you can take the goods, but you don't have to pay me back. When your wife dies, I'm just going to take the farm. Okay, so if you fast forward 21 years later, the wife does die and he does leave the farm. So this happened. And the implication of the story was the child who was with her father, Jack Hill, said Daddy couldn't fight back because someone had been lynched on the courthouse, grounds in recent years past. So there's kind of a pretty explicit threat of violence. And so what happened was Jack, I guess, accepted and really couldn't fight back so he thought, I'm going to lose this farm. So he stopped paying property taxes apparently on the farm. And a few years later, the farm is foreclosed on for non-payer of property taxes. And there is an auction, and the only bidder in the auction is the wife of the shopkeeper who said, I'm going to take your farm. And so she bought it at a very substandard rate. There was no one else there. Apparently it was an auction, but it wasn't like a public auction. So there's actually a bill of sale for the farm. So it's, it's a coercive event, but there actually is a bill of sale. So I think the main thing, or one of the main things that this story, brought about in me is, as I started thinking about it, was that I think in this story is hidden, I think, the idea of a hierarchy of human value. And especially like race, as I said, being mixed race in 1850 protected the folks, but by 1920 it made them vulnerable. And so it really shows, I think, that race is something that's been a profound factor across American history, but it's something that's not static, but it changes, and it can change. And actually, I think the fact that the context of race does and can change is actually what gives it so much power. Mm-hmm. So I guess so. I don't know. Stop it. Do you guys have any questions or?
Is the farm still around now?
Yeah, it's a good question. The farm is owned. So a couple things. The farm, there's a dispute about the farm, and the farm was owned by the family of the Exum family who was the shopkeeper. But in 1876, the Greene County courthouse burned, and so I started investigating that story as well. It's interesting. I found 11 of the 100 courthouses in North Carolina burned during the 1870s. And I can find 2 newspaper stories that say that it was arson, and that the reason the courthouse burned was to try to destroy the land records to enable basically land theft. And what had started to happen was there had been an abolitionist sheriff who apparently had begun undertaking some, essentially providing land to freed slaves. And when the courthouse burned, that enabled basically a lot of land theft. So to fast forward, this farm is in dispute, but it's tough. Everything that happened before 1876 is tough, is difficult to track down in this county because the records were destroyed. So legally, the key would be half of the farm was Jack Hill's. The other half of the farm was the descendant of the other child. And the only way it would have been legal to sell half the farm would have been if the farm had been broken up legally. And there's actually no evidence that it was. So legally it's in dispute, but practically it's been in the possession of that, family.
I'm just really curious about growing up. I remember lots of things that were normal to me and I didn't interrogate. Yeah. I guess do you remember the first time that you realized or that you were aware that, oh, that's where mixed race people live? Where did that kind of mythology come from?
Yeah.
Just interesting to me.
Yeah, I'm not sure when the first time was, but so I graduated from high school in Goldsboro, which is about 20 miles from Greene County, we were talking about. But I was packed off to live with my grandparents in the summers and harvested tobacco. And for sure, by the time I was 10 years old, I knew that Browntown was a place of mixed, where people of mixed race live. And the one thing that's kind of a difficult memory is there would, when older farmhand boys would joke with younger farmhand boys, the kids that were working on tobacco together. I heard it said many times, "Oh, if you're striking out with girls, we need to take you to Browntown some Friday night." So that's marking Browntown as a place where the women are available, um, basically to white people if they want to go there. So I mean, and that's both a horrible thing, but it's jarring because it was just something that wasn't jarring at the time.
Hmm. Just like was accepted as normal, and then you look back and like see all the.
I think. I mean, blind spots are blind spots, right? So I think that's sort of by definition. But I don't think I never really understood how racialized my upbringing was. So I spent lots of time with black kids harvesting tobacco and actually also playing football and sports. So I had a lot of experience of collaboration, succeeding together, failing together, at sports or whatever. But I would never go to their church, or they would never come to my church, or there were just like these, just looking back, like these codes that were just sort of somehow understood. So they're subtle, but actually quite powerful. So if I were to describe that upbringing, it would be like the rural South. I think there's always been a lot more contact between black and white, maybe than in some larger cities, but it's kind of in close contact, but still very, very,
There are
separate.
rules.
Yeah, kind of rules. So what do you think should happen with the farm?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. And it's like, you almost want to like be able to track down like the Jack Hill family and like give it back to them.
I mean, they're around. So
around.
Well, they're not around in Greene County, but there's some. I've found some of them still alive and have been talking with them. They're a little weirded out. They're like, "Why is this white dude interested in this?" Which I mean, I get that, but I mean, so what if you found them? What will we? How will we deal with the fact that there's a bill of sale?
So there is a bill of sale. The land was purchased.
So the way the story goes, best I can nail it down, was the man said, "I'm going to loan you the goods. I'm going to give you the goods. You don't have to pay me back. I'm just going to take the farm when your wife dies. So I'm going to let you live on the farm." And they lived there for like 19 more years. So it's like this slow motion theft, right? So they stopped paying the property taxes, which I think, and it can be hard to nail all these things down, but I think it's because he knew he was going to lose the farm, because the generations of this family on 3 separate occasions had taken out mortgages on the farm and then paid them off. So I mean, it's a family that had been paying things off. So then there was a foreclosure because of failure to pay property taxes. And there was a sale, but there was only one person present at the sale, which was the wife of the shopkeeper. So there was a sale, but it seems like it was a coerced sale at best. but it's a tricky figuring out exactly
So-
what that. Okay.
I think like, especially with like just property, like in general, like over time laws change about race and social norms change, but property generally stays the same.
Yeah.
And so like with things like redlining, you still see like effects today. So
Yes.
I think when you have like a problem that's specifically with property, it's like very difficult to address.
Yes. So in 1931, the federal government set up the tobacco support program. I don't know if you guys realize this, but from 1931 to the year 2002, the federal government limited the amount of tobacco that could be grown in the United States and sold, and also created a price support program, which meant that there was a guaranteed price for tobacco. And if it sold for that price or higher at free auction, then the company would buy RJ Reynolds or Liggett Myers and whoever. But if it didn't sell at that price, the federal government actually bought the tobacco and warehoused it and then later sold it. And so basically, Jack Hill's family lost the farm right as the land was becoming super valuable. So the tobacco price support program made the tobacco land, and this is a prime tobacco farm. The farm that Benjamin Edwards bought for his children was a prime tobacco farm. So it means like today, if we found the descendants of the family that lost the farm or had the farm taken from them, and if we gave them the land back, like that would be a kind of a justice, I think. But that family has missed, 60 years of a very valuable asset. And in fact, in the 60s, the tobacco price support program decoupled the land from the tobacco. So it meant that you could have actually farmed the land and rented your pounds to another farmer. So it actually turned the ability to grow tobacco into a fungible, like, financial asset. So, giving the farm back, as I said, I think it'd be a type of justice perhaps, but it wouldn't actually make up for, the time value of, of money.
Like 2 generations.
Yeah, or maybe even 3
Right.
almost. Yeah. So makes a big difference.
Well, were there, I know there was white communities.
Yeah.
Were there non-mixed-race black communities nearby?
Yes.
Did you find out the relationship with those people?
Yes, it's a great question. Greene County has been about 50-50 black white for like 125 years. And although now there's some fairly substantial Hispanic immigration with agricultural labor. So I know that Browntown was marked as mixed race, and that was something that was just known. What I don't have great insight into is what Black communities thought about that. And I gather I've talked to a few people who live in and around Browntown now, and I think the people who live in Browntown now have really embraced the idea of being Black for the most part. But there's a Facebook group for Browntown, and if you go and look at the pictures of people sharing, there really are, they're very light-skinned. I think people that most of us, and here we're getting into what the heck does race even mean, but if you had showed a picture of somebody and said, I think most people would say, hey, most of the time the folks that you're showing are light-skinned African-American folks. But one very interesting thing that I found is the children of the enslaver and the enslaved. I find the son in 8 censuses, and he's measured 3 different ways racially in 8 censuses. So in 80 years, he's white one time, he's colored one time, then he turns into black, then he becomes mulatto, and then he's black the last time he's measured in the census before he dies. And I don't even know what that really means. Like I don't know if it's just what the person taking the census thought, or if did his identity change. I'm just not sure. So this story is like it's a work in progress. And I don't know if you guys have ever looked, but the historical census have all been digitized. So even all the way back to 1790. And so you can hover over a page on the census and it'll show you, the names written and things like that. But you can also click it and go see the actual document, and it's all handwritten. So there are lots of, like you can look at pages of the census and see somebody with good handwriting, and then on another page, somebody with bad handwriting. So, it's a tricky, it's just a tricky resource, to use, I think. Yeah.
Is there any other type of resources, or is it just like word of mouth?
Resources of
Like as like being able to detail back that far.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, there's tons of materials in archives, and so trying to piece together. I'm just trying to piece together what these folks were doing, at these times. So, like, I found a mortgage from 1883 and another mortgage from 1897 that were both paid off. And that would be very common behavior of farmer, to take a mortgage out on land to buy some implement or something like that. It'd be a pretty common thing. So you can get like these snapshots, but it's like looking at a reality. You can't get the full picture, and especially anything before 1876 it's hard to get land records. The one thing that I would really love to find, so I can find the Edwards family was extremely prominent, so there's lots of information about them, and there are lots of family Bibles from them, and none of them acknowledge Eliza and these 2 children. But I think it's a good question from a research standpoint. Like, what does proof even mean? Like, how could you prove that Benjamin and Eliza had these 2 kids? I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence of that, but it's a good question just from a research standpoint. Like, what does proof even look like? I think the thing that would be really, really strong proof would be to find a family Bible that listed them. So my wonder, Dean Blackshear, is I bet there was a family Bible down the other side of the family that had the truth in it. The question is that anywhere that somebody's laid his hands on it? And there's still materials like over at UNC that there's stuff in boxes that nobody's ever looked at. So there's stuff here at Duke's archives. We one of the things that SSRI is going to be launching next spring and into next fall is what we're calling our working group on reckoning with history. And the way we're defining reckoning is telling the truth about the past and the present, and realizing that incomplete truth is never an accident. It's usually purposeful. And then the second step of reckoning is learning how to talk about hard things. And the thing about learning how to talk about hard things is it is hard, or else everybody would already do it. But I think everybody can get better at it, so you can practice. And it's actually something that's worth practicing. And I think the final step is, what does it mean for us today? Like, what should we do about it, if anything? And that'll be contentious always, but it needs to be struggled with. And we are actually, like the Duke archives, there's tons of super interesting information about Dukes on history that, so for example, Whitney Welsh is a colleague of ours at the Social Science Research Institute, and she's an ethnographer. That's a research approach that often digs into archival stuff, research. And she is undertaking a project right now about Duke's campus history, where there are about 35 boxes of receipts from the building of East Campus and West Campus, and she's in the process of trying to list all the businesses from where materials were bought. Where were the materials bought? What kind of stuff was bought? How much did it cost? And she's then also painstakingly taking yellow pages across the years and trying to understand and look into who was owning the business and what the businesses were like. And one thing we found is that the yellow pages for Durham County from about 1890 way up into the 1930s typically would list a business and then have a C for colored on in the yellow pages. So it's actually the case that, for example, most of the bricks on East Campus were bought from a Black company. So there was actually a fair amount of purchasing of materials from Black businesses. But and my point there, that's just an example of we have this like wealth of information that's just there waiting to be discovered. And so these boxes have, some of them I think haven't been looked in since the 1920s. So, it's like an opportunity to, discover something to the extent that you can discover something that has happened. And those are the types of things, students could be involved in, if you're interested in it. So I'm curious for you guys, do any of you guys have any stories from like your hometown that you use the word mythology and then later you learn that it was either something different or?
I had a bunch. I grew up in Chapel Hill, so
Yeah.
it's just all kinds of
Super weird town, right?
Yeah. Yeah, terrible. No, but one that I was thinking about recently, there's a group at the public library in Chapel Hill doing a podcast on monuments and memory in the wake of Silent Sam being taken down. And I was talking to this girl because she's one of my friends, is working on it, and I realized in my neighborhood there had been this cemetery, like just in the middle of the woods, like a gravestone, a couple of gravestones, and then a circle of rocks around the gravestones. And when I was really little, I remember like we would run around in the woods and stuff, and people would say like that cemetery is haunted, and all the little stones around the big tombstones, those mark the bodies of the enslaved people the family owned. And don't go there like at night, it's haunted and blah, blah, blah. There was this like, I never, in my whole life, I've still never gone at night. But I realized like, she'd asked me like if there were any spots that I remembered having like a lot of weight to them. And that was one that I realized I never checked back and like did any research on whether any of it was true. And if so, like how it changed my conception of my neighborhood, if at all. And so I'm curious to see when the episode comes out, what she finds. But it was a weird thing, something that I felt was like a normal part of the like myths of where I would run around and play, that actually had lots of layers built into it. Like the neighborhood was heavily white, like there were very few families of color. And that was also something like when I look back and I think about like kids telling me about it, like I think about it differently than I did then.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's one.
And just so you know, most every pretty close. Most graveyards in North Carolina have now been digitized. So pictures of the tombstone with information on it. So there's a chance.
Oh, I should look.
There's a chance you can, find.
I can't remember their Pembroke maybe was the name.
Yeah.
Oh, look.
So actually, it's definitely the case. The internet has made archival research, I guess, lots more available to amateurs like myself, as opposed to having to be somebody that's deeply trained in how to do this kind of stuff. So I think one thing that, oh, sorry.
I'm from Savannah, Georgia.
Okay.
It's all kind of But one thing that used to strike me when I was a kid growing up, people find it hard to believe that I really have no recollection of having direct contact with a white person before I was because our entire lives and communities were sort of there. So the grocery store, like going to restaurants, you mentioned everything. And but when we used to drive to church, it was still in the black neighborhood. Where everything was. I remember there was this big graveyard, a Laurel Grove, and so that was literally like 5 houses down the street from where I lived was the entrance to Laurel Grove. But if you go up and around about half mile away to the church I grew up in, there was another entrance to Laurel Grove. And it was made pretty clear that the entrance where I lived was where the blacks would be buried. And the entrance around the other side was where the whites would be buried. And then they built the interstate across the graveyard. That's the sort of the demarcation. And then I began to learn that the streets, you have these long streets, and they can name one thing here. And then like you cross Bull Street, and it's named another thing. And those were other modes of demarcating, who belonged where and what which were supposed to stay. And I've followed these whole lines my whole life when I went to college. I attended Florida A&M in Tallahassee, and you had Florida A&M University, which was PCU. You had Florida State University, which was PWI, and literally down the middle of the two universities was a train track. And so seeing that I grew up around the graveyard, I was really acutely aware of this other demarcation. So I then go to Coshocton, Ohio. That's a weird place. It was this was my current wife is from. It was a place where displaced Delaware Native Americans and some Massachusetts Native Americans were relocated to, and they and with some of the Dutch and all of the folks who were there, it was a Native American leader, Chief Newcomer. Newcomer Town, Ohio is named after him, and developed this community of Roscoe Village. So I go to Roscoe Village. This is to show you how race like, so I'm from Savannah.
Yeah.
Felt what that's like. So I go to Roscoe Village, and my wife is first taking me to the home place. And, reading the sign, it tells me Coshocton means meeting of the rivers. That's Native American term for how these rivers come together. There's some locks that bring boats down into the area there, and then the locks carry boats back out, and then you can head on up to Fort Canada. But it wasn't lost to me that I was walking down the middle of this village, Roscoe Village, on White Woman Street. I'm from Savannah, Georgia. I think I'm supposed to be on the street. And she was like, this is Native Street, White Woman Street. It's very matter of factly. And then there was a doctor's office that was a museum I thought was curious. And so, but she was like, I think you should walk to the end of White Woman Street to see what it's all about. So I walked to the end of White Woman Street and had this big plaque up about Roscoe Village was a safe harbor during the Underground Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
So that doctor's office that was there, and now there's a restaurant right next to it. The spaces that you visit, all the rest of that, the breathing holes in the floor around, and were places where escaped enslaved Africans would go and they would stay for a period of time. But up by the lots at the end of this road, not road, but at the end of this area would be where when the coast was clear, because this was a largely Native American place. When the coast was clear for folks to move through, especially given the neighboring towns like Warsaw, all these other places, they would post a white woman at the bottom of the lot. And so the road where they built this road that leads to where she would post, and they have the signs where they would put various white women who were helping
Yes.
slaves along the paths. But it's a fascinating thing because so many things that I had such a visceral reaction
To White Woman
drinking
Street. Yeah.
coffee, walking down White Woman Street. So it was very intense. Yeah.
Thanks. That's a fascinating story. I think one of the things, and we can wrap it up in a second. One of the things that in working on this project that I feel like I've started reading American history more generally, and I think I've come to really understand like the history of the United States. There are different ways to tell history, but at least one of the ways to tell the history of the United States, I think, is a history of a hierarchy of human value. So we talked about Browntown as being protective in 1850, but then exposing these folks to theft in 1920. But there's always this constant hierarchy that was operating in both places, though white was what had the power. And as I was just sitting down reading the U.S. Constitution one day as I was doing this, and
As everyone
does, but I was doing it because I was thinking, let me just go back to the back and read the U.S. And so, Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, Clause 3 says, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So yeah, the language is a little weird, stilted and weird, but they're basically saying we're counting people in the U.S. to figure out who gets to send folks to Congress, but also to figure out how to apportion taxes. And it's free people. We also count people who aren't free now, but they're essentially indentured servants. But if they've got a time in the future where they're no longer going to be, we're going to go ahead and count them. But we exclude Indians who aren't taxed. So I guess that must mean there were some that were and some that weren't. And then the last clause, 3/5 of all other persons. And so you're like, well, who is that talking about? Well, it's talking about enslaved people. And this just sort of hit me in a way that said, oh my gosh, this is like, there's hierarchy of human value, right? The fingerprints of that idea are all over the U.S. Constitution. So it's not something that, kind of came about. But I mean, it was put into the legal framework, of the country. And I think that, just as I've been wrestling with this, it's the, similar, if you drop down, let's read one more thing. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the Constitution says, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. So what's that saying is they wrote into the Constitution that for 20 years you can't ban the importation of slaves. So, slavery was such a crucial part of the economy of the nation that to get the Constitution agreed to and signed upon, you had to say, we're not going to change this for 20 years. And so, as I'm thinking about that, I think that means people were thinking about, like, if you think in economic terms, like the net present value of all the enslaved people who were owned then, and the importation of people. And it's just, I think it's just a thing that I want to leave you guys with is, I think this idea of a hierarchy of human value is cooked into the cake of this country, almost like flour is. And flour as an ingredient is like dusty and dry. But when it's in a cake, you can't really taste the flour, but it's there kind of holding it all together. And I think that's sort of how this idea is. It's woven into every sort of bit of our shared lives together, but it can be hard to identify it if you don't really look for it. And I think what I would want to leave you guys with is for you to think about, are there examples on this campus, maybe even in this dorm, where there are hierarchies of human value, and for you guys to not be so overwhelmed with the problems of the world, which seem overwhelming, but take the agency that you've got and try to make Duke a little better place.
Didn't that happen with the car building? It's not the classroom building.
Yeah. So do you know? Did you?
I don't really know the story. I just know that something happened with him being a KKK member or something.
Yeah. So do you guys know? So there've been two dorms whose names were changed. There was the ACOC dorm, which I think is now called East House, and then the car building, which is called Classroom Building. I'll give a brief thing of those two folks. So Charles B. Aycock's the most famous person from my hometown, Goldsboro.
I was pretty small at that.
Yeah, and Charles B. Aycock was a governor, and he, when you grow up in Goldsboro, you go to Charles B. Aycock house like for a field trip all the time. And he's called the education governor because he brought about compulsory education for Black and white people, which is true. So that, in one sense, it's an earned notion of education governor. But he was a pretty virulent white supremacist and was a part of the movement that led to really violent kind of pushback from sort of 1895 into the first century of the first decade of the 20th century, and so like he actually was one of the two North Carolinians whose statue was in Statuary Hall until just recently. So it's an example of the history that was told about him was incomplete, and I think in one sense we can. In one sense, applying what we know today to people in the past is that's a tricky thing to do. But it's also, I think, wrong to tell only incomplete story. I mean, these people were people, human beings that had flaws and good things and bad things. So the better thing to do is, I think, to learn to tell the whole story. And different people are going to think that means different things of what you should do, but we decided on the campus that he shouldn't be have a dorm named after him any longer. And for one sense, he'd had a dorm named after him for 80 years or something at that point. Julian Carr, and one thing, Charles B. Aycock really didn't have any link to Duke that I know of. He was a governor of North Carolina. Julian Carr, though, did have a huge role in the fact, Duke. He gave land. I think he probably gave the land that we're sitting on right this second. He also, I think it's fair to say that Duke probably wouldn't exist in this form that it has now without Julian Carr. He was Carborough,
I always wonder if we'll ever.
where Leah's from is named after him.
It's ironic because.
Yes. And Leah mentioned Silent Sam, which was the Confederate statue on UNC's campus. Julian Carr actually gave a pretty viciously sort of racist invocation when Silent Sam on UNC's campus was put up. And if you go and read his, if you're interested in this, you should go, Google Julian Carr Silent Sam, and you can find the speech that he gave. And so when people say, Confederate statues are commemorating the war dead, if you really get into the history, there were kind of two periods of when statues were put up. For the 10 or 15 years after Civil War, there were a lot put up in cemeteries. But then from about 1900 up until about 1930, there were a lot of statues put up, usually in public places. And I think a fair look at the historical record shows that most of the ones put up in the so-called second wave were basically put up to try to reassert or to make clear essentially white supremacy. So Julian Carr, his role, especially with that Silent Sam, dedication, that also led Duke to decide that the building should no longer be named after him. I think that was actually a trickier decision for Duke because he had given so much to Duke. So I'm not saying we did the wrong thing. This is just my personal, I don't find the ACOG decision to be quite as difficult as the Julian Carr's decision. But I do think it would be a terrible mistake to wipe away the history so if taking monuments down or changing names, that shouldn't mean we're throwing history away. It should mean that what we know makes us want to learn more, I think. Okay, so thank you guys for coming. And I just want to tell you, if you guys want to get involved in research on any of these topics or anything, we would love to try to help you do that. So,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.